protect the interests of both the student and the University of Louisville.
Yeah, so Rick Pitino got that unpaid leave, which translates into you out of here. Tom Jurich, did you see the story he put out there? Because the Post of Louisville said this isn't true, but the story that Jurich apparently put out there that they didn't actually fire him. They asked him to fire Pitino. He refused to fire Pitino, and then they fired him.
Look, I don't know why Juris doesn't want that to be known. Like, I wouldn't deny it. Even if it wasn't true, I would say that's exactly how it happened, because I'm down with my guy.
No, I'm saying that's what he put out there, but they asked about it at the press conference, and the folks in Louisville were like, nah, that ain't
Check.
And I'm going to get the best coaches I can get. So he got Pitino, and he held his head, and he weathered the storm through the whole thing.
I'm gonna smoke a blunt before I start this game.
Through the whole strippers at the dorm thing, and this is the one where I feel like Jurich was like, all right, man, I got you back one more time. Let's go do it. And they're like, no, y'all both got to go. And I guess there was nothing that Jurich was ever going to have to gain at any point from getting rid of Pitino, because Pitino was more important to him.
You bring your phone everywhere. Work, school. Sorry, I got to keep this. Restrictions apply. Limited to around the goal.
Well, podcast. Good to have basketball back. It's been like a whole week from Sunday to this Thursday, right? The days in between those days. Okay?
Welcome to my... I don't know what's coming on the show today. Oh yeah, that's right. I wasn't there. You're going to hear about it in the open of the show. John was not with us this week when we taped the show for reasons that he'll explain to you now. I was there right before we were taping, and my daughter, Olivia, got admitted to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. It was a very strange...
ESPN says NCAA basketball coaches among 10 charged with fraud and corruption. So let's read this article. And if you're wondering what schools, it says in paragraph 2, it says Auburn, Oklahoma State, Arizona, and USC. So this article says federal prosecutors have announced charges of fraud and corruption in college basketball, including against 4 coaches. Auburn assistant Chuck Person, Oklahoma State assistant Lamont Evans, Arizona assistant Emmanuel Richardson, and USC assistant Tony Bland. So Auburn, Oklahoma State, Arizona, and USC all have assistants arrested for fraud and corruption. They were among 10 people charged in New York City federal court. Others included managers, financial advisors, and representatives of a major international sportswear company. The details will be discussed at a news conference on Tuesday afternoon. That's going to be today, I think at noon Eastern, about an hour and a half. In court papers, prosecutors said the FBI has since 2015 been investigating the criminal influence of money on charges. The FBI has since 2015 been investigating the criminal influence of money on charges and student athletes who participate, maybe on coaches and student athletes who participate in the intercollegiate basketball governed by the NCAA. They said the probe has revealed numerous instances of bribes and paid by athlete advisors, including financial advisors, numerous instances of bribes paid by athlete advisors, including financial advisors and associate basketball coaches, to assistant and associate basketball coaches to exert influence over student athletes. So it looks like it's kind of confusingly written. Bribes paid by student advisors, including financial advisors and associate basketball coaches, to assistant and associate basketball coaches to exert influence over student athletes. It's a little confused. They're paying the bribes to assistant coaches? Is that what's happening? I'm confused. This article is a bit confusing, but the key details from this article are 10 people were charged in New York City federal court, and 4 of them include Auburn assistant Chuck Person, Oklahoma State assistant Lamont Evans, Arizona assistant Emmanuel Richardson, and USC assistant Tony Bland. So we have coaches from those 4 schools who are charged with crimes. Now, I have no idea, will the NCAA discipline these schools because the coaches have been charged with crimes? Remember, this is not the NCAA. A lot of times when you hear about like coaches being disciplined for misconduct. It's the NCAA doing the disciplining.
Yeah.
It's not the FBI law enforcement. This is FBI law enforcement arresting 4 assistant coaches, and at least according to the NBC Nightly News, they said FBI arrests several assistant coaches. They said it was about sports apparel, but here this looks like, you know, we can't tell. Maybe some charges are fraud and corruption of some sort. Some involve fraud and corruption involving sports apparel. Hard to say right now what's going on. Let's look at the Wall Street Journal article here. They say arrest expected in probe of alleged bribery, kickbacks at college basketball programs. Now they say arrests expected, but NBC said there already have been arrests, and on
point.
This was annoying.
Clean. Woo! That haircut is looking sharp. I guarantee when you leave here.
He's like, I'm a black man that makes funny faces, so I must be hilarious.
Shout out to the peril of road rage. Listen, know your space, stay in your lane, and know what your vehicle is capable of. You know what I'm saying?
Oh my God, we did that just to cut in front.
Oh, I've seen this.
See, shout out the car. Anytime someone gets out the car on the highway in the passing lane, yo, come on.
Yeah, it's beat.
This motherfucker! I'm fucking dead!
Yo, man, he's like, roll your fucking window down for him.
Wow.
I'm not saying he said anything racist. He just looks a little racist.
He's like, yeah, you better stay in your goddamn car. I bet you won't do shit.
He said,
Oh, spit on him.
all right, now that changes everything. Once someone spits on you, all bets is off.
Yeah, it's a,
Anything you do after that is justified.
Yep, it's admissible. Okay.
He's like, word? Okay, I got you. You gonna run him over? Psych! Oh! Wow! Oh, wow!
That's a
That was a
fail.
bad time to tell your passengers you have insurance through the general.
Damn.
Yeah.
What was he? He was trying to like flip him.
He was trying to clip his door off. That's exactly what they're trying to do. He's like, yo, I'm gonna take your whole fucking door off and keep it moving.
Damn.
And then when you have those cars and you flip the visor down, it says in like French and English or Spanish, chill, because this car may flip over very easily. That's exactly what happened to your man, B.
You want to play his time to read that on the side while he's waiting for the tow truck to flip it over. That's the turn mode, my guy.
Yo.
He's already
You're watching a decent on our YouTube channel,
It's
stupid.
Click
ironic.
to watch more videos and clips.
Subscribe, please.
Click and comment.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today, 10 more awesome military mottos from around the world. So, a while ago, we made another video like this talking about very cool mottos from military units.
It's a quiet morning just before dawn. In Temujin's camp, the family sleeps peacefully, thinking their troubles are behind them. They are very wrong. Even now, 300 Merkit soldiers thunder towards them on horses. June 1948, the Oval Office. The cabinet gathers for a conference with President Truman. 4 days prior, the Soviet Union blockaded the American, British, and French-occupied sectors of Berlin. With the divided city located 100 miles inside the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany, there's no way for American food and fuel, the lifeline of its undernourished populace, to get through. The city only has 36 days worth of food remaining, and only 45 days of coal. Allied troops are surrounded, outnumbered 62-1. The cabinet lays out 3 options. 1. American forces could withdraw, but that would signal that Western democracies are unable to counter Soviet aggression. 2. They could stay in Berlin until the starving population forces them out, and accept Soviet rule out of desperation. Or 3. They could send an armed convoy to open the roads, but that would start another world war. They advised Truman to withdraw. Truman says, "We stay in Berlin, period." You remember that series on Hiawatha we did a while back? Those episodes were sponsored by and we enjoyed doing those so much that when they said, hey, we're about to introduce the Cold War era into our game, you want to do some episodes about that? Our answer was, heck yeah we do. So today we are going to talk about the Berlin Airlift, an event that not only set off the Cold War, but established how it would be fought. You see, after Germany's surrender in World War II, the Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: the Soviets in the east, and the Americans, British, and French in the west. And Berlin, though it lay in the Soviet zone, was divided as well. The problem was that the Allies had 2 competing, irreconcilable visions for Germany. The Soviets had suffered 2 German invasions in the span of 30 years. They wanted this country broken and subordinate, so it could never threaten Russia again. They also wanted it to function as a buffer zone to keep the Western powers at bay. In the end, Stalin's goal was a communist puppet state in Germany and the Allies out of Berlin. But America and Britain believed that Nazi extremism had arisen due to the Great Depression, and that the best chance for a peaceful Europe was a prosperous democratic Germany. They also hoped that it would be a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. So this joint occupation effort was doomed to failure from the outset. But the final showdown came over currency. Berlin was in economic ruin. Allied bombing had destroyed most of its industrial foundation, and even 3 years after the war, most Berliners lived in the basements of shattered buildings. Some were living on just 900 calories a day.
Damn, 900 calories a day, that's like...
Which was so low that a loaf of bread often cost an entire paycheck. The city's real currency at this point was American cigarettes, and most civilians survived by a combination of black market, food aid, and prostitution. The Allies made an attempt at currency reform, but this attempt failed when the Soviets sabotaged the effort by printing billions of extra notes. By 1948, the frustrated Western powers were secretly planning
Okay, you have food, bud.
the Deutschmark, and then behind Stalin's back to discuss forming a West German state. The Soviets found out about this, and in protest, abandoned the Four-Power Council. In response, the Western Allies released the new currency, and Stalin had his pretext. On June 23rd, Soviet troops encircled Berlin, blockading the road and rail line the Allies had been using to supply the city. The city's power station, located in the Soviet sector, cut electricity. The Berlin blockade had begun, and Truman had to choose between retreat or war. But there was another possibility. The Soviets had interrupted traffic to Berlin before, months earlier, but the Allies had continued supplying their troops via air. Truman wondered whether a similar airlift could supply all of Berlin. After all, the only way you can stop a plane is to shoot at it, which would be an act of war. American generals dismissed this idea as impossible. But the Royal Air Force thought different. After years of war shortages, the British were experts in rationing, and they ran the numbers. They concluded that it would take 4,000 tons of food and fuel per day to keep Berlin from collapsing. But to move that much cargo and C-47 transports would mean over 1,300 flights every 24 hours. And only the Americans had that capacity. Under pressure from Truman, the U.S. generals agreed to try. The first flight began on June 26th. Despite Soviet threats, the anti-aircraft guns stayed silent. They had called Stalin's bluff. But the airlift didn't have enough planes or crews. The Air Force tried bringing in air wings from as far away as Guam, but it still wasn't enough. 2 weeks in, the airlift was only delivering 1,000 tons per day, a quarter of what they needed. And conditions were perilous. The American airport at Tempelhof was a grass field that needed to be patched between landings. An apartment block stood directly on the approach path, its roof just 17 feet below the landing gear. And those C-47s were old leftovers from the war. Coal and flour dust, both of which were explosive, by the way, filled the plane's cargo holds. The 24-hour nature of this operation strained both the airmen and their antiquated planes, and all the while, Soviet Yak fighters buzzed the transports, keeping the pressure on. But despite the shortfall on the cargo quota, the airlift spurred a wave of enthusiasm. Across Europe, people set aside wartime grudges in an effort to keep Berlin from starving. Blitz survivors in London sent care packages to Berlin. Many RAF mechanics didn't even wait to be called up. They just grabbed their toolboxes and hitched a flight to Hamburg. Germans, previously hostile to the pilots who had leveled their cities, instead began plying Allied airmen with beer. It was a chaotic cowboy operation. So Washington dispatched a man to tame it. General William Tunner was a taciturn man who loved him some charts. During the war, he had commanded an airlift that flew supplies over the Himalayas and into occupied China. Now, he was given the objective of delivering 4,000 tons per day. First thing first, he created a tight schedule. Planes would take off and land at precise 3-minute intervals, and the flights would stack at 5 altitudes, maximizing the number of planes in the air. When the crews landed, they'd have 30 minutes to unload before taking off again. Tunner also enforced maintenance checks, brought in fresh U.S. Navy pilots, and replaced the C-47s with larger capacity C-54s. To make up for the ground crew shortage, he hired Germans to unload cargo and patch runways. And after translating the maintenance manuals, he assigned former Luftwaffe mechanics to repair planes. Men who had been shooting at each other only 3 years before now worked side by side. Tunner's shakeup worked. On August 12th, the airlift reached its target for the first time, 4,500 tons. Then, Tunner discovered that one of his pilots, Gail Halverson, had been making unauthorized cargo drops. Every time Halverson came in for a landing, he would drop off little handkerchief parachutes containing parcels of candy to the children that gathered near the runway. Berliners loved it, and Tunner saw the PR potential. He ordered the candy drops expanded and sent Halverson on a press tour back home. The airlift, a humanitarian effort without traditional military heroes, finally had a public face. And that PR victory was good news because winter was coming. The Soviets had been stalling diplomatically for exactly this reason. Surely deteriorating weather would put a stop to this airlift for good. Fog came in heavy that season. At times, it lay so thick on the runways that ground crews had to crawl for fear of walking into an unseen propeller. Aircraft landed in zero visibility with iced-up engines. They collided in midair. They smashed into mountain ranges. Exhausted pilots fell asleep at the stick. Meteorologists, circling in B-29s, alerted ground control of 15-minute breaks in the weather that would allow flights to get through. And somehow, they did. On New Year's Eve, 1948, Allied forces delivered over 6,000 tons, a new record. And as winter passed and the weather began to let up, the airlift began delivering more supplies than the city had ever received by rail. This success emboldened anti-Soviet politicians within Berlin. In September, Ernst Reuter, elected mayor in 1947 but blocked from taking his seat by the Soviets, gave a fiery speech before a crowd of 300,000 Berliners, imploring the world not to abandon the city to totalitarianism. That December, he won the mayor's office, appearing around the world as the face of Free Berlin. In retaliation, the Soviets installed their own communist city government in East Berlin. Stalin's strategy had backfired. Instead of preventing a West German state, he had fueled it. Far from revealing Allied weaknesses, he had allowed them to take the moral high ground, demonstrating their commitment and turning Germans from an occupied people into comrades. And the blockade was damaging East Berlin's economy. Its factories couldn't function without goods from the western sector. The Soviets had been outmaneuvered. On May 12, 1949, Soviet soldiers removed the roadblocks and allowed the first American supply convoy to pass into Berlin. That road would never close again. In 15 months of operation, the airlift delivered over 2.4 million tons of food and fuel, saving Berlin from famine. 79 Allied personnel and German civilians lost their lives to the effort, and the world would never be the same. Stalin's willingness to starve civilians marked a turning point, uniting Western Europe in a coalition to contain Soviet influence. A month before the end of the blockade, this new alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formally signed into being. And within weeks, West Germany formally became a country, followed by communist East Germany. Europe was divided in half. And 2 months later, the Soviets
what are you doing?
First atomic bomb. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, one of political influence, fought by great powers over proxy states.
What are you doing, babe?
Threats and restraint, where governments tested just how far they could push the other without starting a full-scale conflict. But the Soviets and the Americans would never
wait. Where are you gonna go?
as directly as they did during the airlift.
Where?
When nuclear armament is in play, that is just not the kind of gamble you take.
Come on, I'm trying to talk to you. Open up.
Domination for sponsoring this episode. We'll see you soon.
Are you gonna bring me some back? What are you gonna bring me back? Wow, okay, whatever. It's gonna keep being like that with me. See what happens. I'm gonna end up breaking up with you. My girlfriend's being nothing but a little bitch to me. She's being nothing but a little bitch to me.
And simultaneously, everyone started to think of the post-war settlement. If the...
When the signal is given, The whole circle of avenging nations.
Okay, I'm gonna spark a blunt.
themselves upon the fire.
Game don't start till 7 o'clock.
Of the greatest tyranny
Like your game don't start
we
till
have ever sought
7.
to bar the progress of mankind.
That signal comes today.
Hey, come on.
This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free.
My dog is literally sitting on my wheelchair behind me.
D-Day, June 6th,
His little back is so warm. I like to lean on
Months of
him.
effort have been building up to this day. Throughout England, 500,000 men have been gathered at staging areas to strike across the channel as soon as the signal is given. Men from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Poland. Today, we'll be telling the American story, as best it can be told in a few short minutes, and over the coming weeks, thanks to the generous support of Wargaming, we will tell the story of 3 of the other major players involved. But that story begins with a dinner in Tehran in 1943. For the first time, the leaders of the most powerful Allied nations, the United States, the USSR, and the British Empire, met in one room. For years, Stalin, his nation battered by the Nazi invasion and bearing the brunt of the human cost of the war against Germany, had pressed the Allies to open up a second front to the war by invading France. The British had pushed back, arguing for operations in North Africa, and then an assault on Italy. But now, with the USSR winning on the Eastern Front, the demands from Stalin became harder to deny, and simultaneously, everyone started to think of the post-war settlement. If the Allies won without British and American troops liberating Western Europe, how could they stop the USSR from claiming huge swaths of land, and perhaps even at least politically dominating the continent? And so an agreement was made out in the deserts of Iran. The Western powers would open up a second front by invading France in May of 1944. Plans were drawn up. An amphibious operation of this size had never been tried. Men and material would have to be drawn back from around the world. New technologies would have to be invented. Engineering feats previously only discussed in conference rooms would have to be put to the test under wartime conditions. But the first decision that had to be made was where to land. There were 2 possible targets: Calais, the closest point in Europe to England, or Normandy, one of the farthest on the Channel coast. Calais was the sane, sensible place to land, but it had 2 notable disadvantages. First, terrain in which you could easily get bogged down, and second, the fact that it was the sane, sensible place to land. Reviewing the battle plan, Eisenhower and Montgomery were in agreement. They wanted the element of surprise, with the possibility of being able to rush off the beach.
baby.
The decision was made. Normandy it would be. But this would require one of the greatest counterintelligence operations ever attempted to keep the secret.
Oh yeah, babe!
Not to mention the equipment and the manpower on an even greater scale. Entire harbors had to be fabricated which could be shipped over from England. More landing craft needed time to roll off the factory line, so the operation was delayed until June. Finally, the day arrives. June 4th, 1944. Planes prep, final drills are run through, tens of thousands of men board ships for the invasion, and then the rain starts to roll in. Soon it becomes a storm. Ferocious waves sweep the channel. Clouds completely block the sky. High winds buffet any craft that ventures on sea, land, and especially air. Eisenhower is forced to make the decision. The attack must be delayed. Rain continues to pour the next day. A council of Allied commanders is called. If they delay again, they won't be able to launch until July. They need to do the channel crossing at night. They need to do commando raids and mine sweeping.
Get that movie.
The unsuspecting Germans will have the fewest
Try to get that
patrols
movie,
out.
because then when you
But
get
for
home
something
after
of
the
this magnitude,
Laker game,
they
we'll lay
need
down.
Nearly full moon visibility. Even if
We'll
they
cuddle
did decide
and watch
to brave
Justice
a
League.
launch without the full moon, tidal conditions wouldn't be right for another 2 weeks. What do they do? They've got thousands of men already holed up on boats, getting seasick and
Dude, I hate when I smoke a blunt, I get the hiccups. Do you ever get that?
They've already started moving equipment and
No, it's like right when I start.
areas which can clearly only
I
be
get
targeting one
that
place,
shit. I hate
Normandy. And they've had to alert enough people up and down the chain as to the nature of the operation that with each passing day, the odds of keeping their landing location a secret plummet. But to cross in this weather, that would be madness. Then a captain is ushered in. He's an RAF meteorologist, and he is about to make what may well be the most consequential weather report of all time. He says he believes it's going to be clear on the 6th. Eisenhower nods. The operation is a go. 6,000 ships begin to steam across the channel. Minesweepers fan out ahead of them, clearing a path. For weeks, the Allied forces have bombed the German Air Force in the region nearly to oblivion. No enemy interceptors exist to spot the waves of gliders.
But we didn't bomb the beach properly. Hello? Are you going to mention that, how we missed the bombing spots before the invasion?
But the airborne infantry has night work to do. First in are the Pathfinders.
Yep, the Pathfinders got to lay down lights.
The drop zones for all the other parachute infantry.
And then the paratroopers have to come and get bridges and key areas that the Allies are going to need.
Getting to France, and the remaining 2 kept most of their signaling gear in the ditched plane, leaving them desperately trying to signal the paratroopers by waving flashlights at passing airplanes. The paratrooper drop goes even worse. Scattered by enemy anti-aircraft fire and blinded by low clouds, paratroopers jump from
but the Germans thought
too high, leaving them
there was more
drifting
paratroopers
slowly, unable to do anything but watch as enemy guns
freaked out.
shrapnel up at them, or too low, breaking bones on landing as their parachutes don't have enough time to slow their fall. They're scattered all over, many of them landing miles from their drop zones, some landing in marshes or rivers, others being slaughtered as they drop right into the middle of the enemy. It was a harrowing and confusing night of chaotic firefights and desperate small unit actions. But the more veteran of the American airborne troops, groups like the Screaming Eagles and the 505th, managed to pull together to capture crucial road junctions, communication points, and bridges, and even destroyed some of the artillery batteries that would imperil the landing at Normandy. And they would hold fast, delaying or preventing any counterattack that might sweep the impending invasion back into the sea. Then there's the initial bombardment. Allied bombing runs go astray, causing massive damage to the civilian centers in Normandy, but doing little to weaken the dug-in German positions. As dawn breaks, though, the Allied gunners can finally see their targets, and the bombardment becomes far more effective, softening up the beach for the initial assault.
No, it doesn't. You're wrong.
There's little time remaining until the troops' scheduled landing. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the klaxons sound, and the assault craft are released. They plow through the chop, men huddled in their tin shells as German fire pours down, sinking entire landing crafts to the bottom of the sea just off the Normandy coast. Then the assault craft hit the beach, ramps drop, and men charge out. But on Utah Beach, things have already gone horribly. The men look around them and the terrain's all wrong. They've landed on the wrong beach. Luckily for the Americans, the oldest man in the invasion, and the only general to actually join these ground troops, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., happens to have landed with them. The local commanders ask him what they should do, and living up to his namesake, he simply responds, "We'll start the war from right here." He correctly assessed that the beach that they'd landed on was actually a better, more easily takeable landing point than the one that the senior staff had assigned them. In a miracle of heroism and logistical coordination, he managed to reroute the entire Utah Beach invasion force to his location, direct the battle, and continuously rally the men as he walked the beach with his cane, waving his pistol. His new Utah Beach would be the first beach successfully overrun, and for his actions there, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Omaha, though, was a different story. Here, the pre-landing bombardment had been even less effective. The seas were choppy, landing craft took on water, and men tried to bail with their helmets. Some of the landing craft sank, and those that landed were filled with retching, seasick men. Much of the armored support that was supposed to follow them foundered in the waves, or simply got picked off as they hit the shore. Soon, the men were all pinned down into a small shingle of land that provided what little cover there was to be found on the beach. Many of the units had taken heavy casualties, and much of the command staff was dead. With units getting washed ashore in the wrong places, or scattered in the desperate scramble to try to get to the small ridge of sand that served as cover, the assault had become hopelessly disorganized. The second wave met with much the same fate. Hopelessly bogged down, withdrawal from Omaha Beach.
I gotta rewind what he's saying on Omaha, because he missed the whole part where I wrote in the comments right now that he missed the whole part during the bombardment earlier that day. The B-17s dropped all their ammunition more inland, and all they did was kill cows and scare the shit out of farmers. They didn't really take out any of the gun emplacements on Utah Beach. That's why mad fools got massacred on Omaha and Utah Beach, because they didn't take out any of the gun emplacements.
bail with their helmets.
At least I think on
His
Utah.
new Utah beach would be the first
Or
beach
Omaha.
successfully
Omaha Beach.
overrun, and for his actions there, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor.
Damn.
Omaha, though, was a different story.
Exactly,
Here,
see?
the pre-landing bombardment had
Missed.
been even less effective. The seas
It
were
straight
choppy,
missed.
landing craft took on water,
Wasn't even
and men
effective, bro.
tried
They
to
missed
bail with
altogether.
their helmets. Some of the landing craft sank, and those that landed were filled with retching, seasick men. Much of the armored support that
Like our
was
game
supposed to
starts at
follow
7 o'clock.
foundered in the waves, or simply got picked off as they hit the shore. Soon, the men were all pinned down against a small shingle of land that provided what little cover there was to be found on the beach. Many of the units had taken heavy casualties, and much of the command staff was dead. With
Yeah.
units getting washed ashore in the wrong places, or scattered in the desperate scramble to try to get to the small ridge of sand that served as cover, the assault had become hopelessly disorganized. The second wave met with much the same fate. Hopelessly bogged down, withdrawal from Omaha Beach was considered, but it was the vital linking point between the British and American forces. As the day wore on, a number of ranger units began to rally and scaled the bluffs, finally managing to assault German positions on the heights. At the same time, several of the naval ships came dangerously close to the beach to provide more effective support fire,
Yep,
just
finally,
as the German
to
ammunition
take out
began to
those
run out.
guns
Even
that they
after
had.
all of this, Omaha Beach wasn't truly cleared by
Nope.
the end of the 6th. But as the sun began to set on those bloodied beaches, it was clear that the American forces were there to stay.
Yep.
Join us next time as we join the British for...
Everything he said mostly was right, except for he totally missed the whole bombardment. He missed the fact that
The
the
south of
army
England
missed.
had become a vast military camp, jam-packed with hundreds of thousands
Air
of
Force.
soldiers, all planning on a trip to the Normandy beaches in the early summer. The job of the
What took out those guns
British
emplacements were the
MI5
boats,
was to make
after all.
sure that on D-Day, the Germans
They
were
had to take it
looking
upon
the other
themselves
way.
to go.
If they
They were taking
failed,
too many
tens
losses.
of thousands of men would die.
I mean, I'm smoking a blunt if you're wondering why I'm
This episode
coughing.
is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. In August 1942, desperate to score a success in the face of an unending string of military setbacks and defeats, the Allies carried out a daring raid on the French port of Dieppe. But the Germans were ready for them, fortified and prepared for the attack. It was an unmitigated disaster, leaving almost 4,000 Canadians dead on the beaches. This catastrophe convinced everybody that when the real invasion of France came, the Germans must not be prepared for it, or D-Day would mean destruction. This was, of course, going to be a little tricky. By 90 days after D-Day, the U.S. Army alone plans to have 1.2 million men with all of their equipment in France. You can't just hide that under a bit of camouflage netting. And so was born Operation Fortitude, the most ambitious deception plan in military history. The operation wouldn't pretend that there was to be no invasion. That would be impossible. Instead, their goal would be to fool the Germans about how many were coming, when they would land,
Yep.
and where they would
They
land.
had fake planes
Army
on a
groups
different
were
beach.
positioned around
They had
Britain
fake
to confuse
tanks.
the Germans. The British 4th Army was stationed in Scotland, supposedly preparing to attack Norway.
Yep.
General George Patton became the proud commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group, stationed on the English coast opposite the Pas de Calais, the closest crossing to France. The British 4th and the U.S. 1st were somewhat unusual armies in that there were no actual people in them. They were completely
Fake, yep.
made up, non-existent. The Allies had no real soldiers to spare. They were all needed in France for the actual
Or
invasion.
Italy.
So to get the Germans to fall
They're
for
either
this
in France or
massive
Italy at the
bluff,
time.
the film industry
And
was
getting ready
called
for
in.
Japan.
They created
Or
a
actually
brilliant
taking on
illusion,
Japan at the
an
time, because we
entire
took on
movie
Japan
army,
before we
wooden
took on
aircraft,
Germany.
inflatable tanks,
Hear that?
250 fake
Fake
landing craft.
planes, all that.
In
I've seen
space,
this, yep.
core headquarters
Not this
were
video, but
invented,
I've heard
pouring
about
out
this.
a constant stream of radio drivel. At one point,
Just fake
King
news.
George VI even made an official inspection
Announcement,
visit,
yep.
solemnly inspecting row after row of blow-up tanks and real troops who had been bussed in for the
Just
day,
for the day,
all
yeah.
while the daily newsreel broadcast this inspection to the world. George even managed to look thoroughly impressed. And, because you might as well go big or go home, this inflatable 1st U.S. Army was presented not just as a threat, but as the threat. The primary invasion force to be launched at the Pas de Calais. The Germans already considered this to be the
Yep,
most
they thought,
likely
so they bid it.
destination for the Allied
The only
attack.
one who didn't believe
Now
it was
the Allies
Rommel.
just needed to make
Rommel
sure that the
strengthened
Germans
Normandy
continued to
because he
believe
just
that.
didn't
And
feel
so
right.
was born MI5's 20 Committee. so called for the XX Roman numerals, double cross. Double cross fed the Germans a constant stream of highly credible intel, a combination of utter rubbish and brilliant information delivered just too late to be useful. Back in 1939, the British had turned a German agent into a double agent. He was pretty useless, but he had told MI5 everything they needed to know about how the German Secret Service communicated with their agents. The 20 Committee used this information to create an entire network of double agents.
Damn.
By D-Day, Germany's entire network of spies in Britain was owned by the 20 Committee. One agent was a Catalan codenamed Garbo. Garbo created a completely fictitious network of 27 agents who bombarded the German embassy in Madrid with messages, presenting an utterly convincing and utterly false picture. The real attack, they said, would come in the Pas de Calais. Any other perceived invasions, such as, I don't know, Normandy, whatever, those were
Normandy,
fakes.
whatever.
If you hear any guns or shouting over there, just relax, it's just the neighbors again, go back to bed. Garbo was good at his job. So good, in fact, that the Germans awarded him with the Iron Cross for his invaluable services.
What?
The danger, though, was that even if they fooled the Germans before the invasion, once the Allies landed, the deception would be over. All German military strength in
Would
France
just go
would
straight
be
there.
concentrated on Normandy, and the Allies would then, no doubt, be driven back into the sea. So, a series of new operations were concocted to convince the Germans that other invasions would follow the first all along the coast of France. Secrecy was critical.
What made this work even better is on D-Day the night before, when we dropped paratroopers, since the Pathfinders were scattered and they couldn't set up their equipment, all the other paratroopers incoming were scattered. So when the Germans looked up, it looked like thousands of paratroopers were landing everywhere, and they're getting scattered calls because one paratrooper didn't land in one specific spot. They all scattered. So the German army thought the invasion was way bigger than it was. They thought it was 20 times bigger because of the paratroopers, how they accidentally landed in different spots. That was on accident. They weren't supposed to land in different spots. They did because the planes came in too low and other planes got shot down and they just bailed. So the German army seen that and was like, oh shit, we're really getting invaded fat here. But they didn't realize the invasion force was smaller. A lot of Germans straight ran away and left their post because they thought the invasion force was bigger.
Forces, a complete photographic map of all
They didn't leave their post scared. They left to regroup and come back, but they still left their post. And that gave us the upper hand to capture bridges because fools dipped. Then they came back and it was just too late when they came back. We were already set up. And
Chad Valley was commissioned to take this intel and make a vast map of the operational area in jigsaw puzzle to the sea. So, a series of new operations were concocted to convince the Germans that other invasions would follow the first all along the coast of France. Secrecy was critical. To help the invading forces, a complete photographic map of all of the beaches was needed. The RAF and USAAF ran hundreds of photographic missions, but they needed more. So the public were asked to send in all of their holiday beach photos. Then the toy maker Chad Valley was commissioned to take this intel and make a vast map of the operational area in jigsaw puzzle form for easy mobility. The jigsaw map was delivered by two men in two pieces. Neither of them knew which was the real one, and once the delivery was complete, neither was allowed to leave headquarters until D-Day was over. The British Armed Forces were obsessive about security. They arranged for 30 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force to dress in civilian clothes and visit pubs close to where the British commandos were staying. Their job? To flirt with the men and try to get them to spill some information about their mission. To everybody's amazement and delight, the commandos kept quiet. MI5 still worried that the news was out, though, and that the Germans would be ready and waiting. Back in 1942, the crossword in the Daily Telegraph newspaper had included a clue answered by the word Dieppe, just one day before the Dieppe raid had taken place. Worrisome. And now, on May 2nd, in the same crossword section came the clue, one of the U.S., and the answer was Utah, the code name for one of the beaches the Americans were to land on. Then, on the 22nd of May, came the answer Omaha, another beach. And then later, Mulberry and Overlord and Neptune, all code words for various D-Day operations.
How did they know?
Finally, MI5 descended in a fury upon Leonard Daw, the schoolmaster who wrote these crosswords. Turns out that it was all just an extraordinary series of coincidences.
Bullshit.
But the big question remained, Had all
I don't
this
believe it's a
deception and
coincidence.
secrecy worked?
Think about how he
would
named
the
out
Allies know
Mulberry
if it had?
Overlord.
They needed
Come on
to
now,
be
those
able
are
to
all.
read German communications to be sure. The Germans used an extraordinarily complex encoding system, Enigma. The code
You gotta watch the movie. I watched it last night.
159 million,
Fuck, what's the name of it?
possible
It has the guy who played Doctor Strange.
Impossible to read, but
he was a gay guy from Britain who cracked the Enigma code, and he built a computer to always solve the Enigma. And fuck, what was the name of it? Fuck, I was looking at the movie last night. I don't know. I'll think of it later. Let's finish watching this.
But the British thought that they could crack the code.
They did.
They assembled a team of brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing at
That's his
Bletchley
name,
Park
Alan
to do
Turing.
it. Then the Allies had a lucky break. In May of
built a
1941,
computer.
a British ship forced a German U-boat to the surface.
And
The Germans
inside they had an
abandoned their
Enigma
sinking
machine.
craft, but in the final moments, the British sailors managed to board and capture the most unimaginable treasure. A completely intact code machine and code books.
Yep.
Soon, and for much of the rest of the war,
We
the
knew what
British
they were
were
saying.
routinely reading German messages. One estimate has suggested that the intelligence gained from this find may have shortened the war by more than 2 years.
Damn.
It was through that intelligence that the Allies learned that the 20 Committee had been stunningly successful. When the balloon finally went up, every key German commander greeted the news of operations in Normandy as an invasion, but not
The invasion, yep.
Critical German focus, men, and material remained on the Pas de Calais even after D-Day, confusing, slowing, and weakening the German response. It was little short of a miracle. And so D-Day began for the British and Canadian forces.
And American.
The British beaches were called Gold and Sword,
And
the
Juno
Canadian
was
beach,
Canadian.
Juno. Churchill had insisted on proper names rather than silly code names, saying that no mother wanted to hear that her son had given his life at the Bunny Hub landings.
The Bunny
British
Hub
parachute
landings.
drop, despite massive confusion, achieved most objectives in the face of incredible odds. 700 men and a complete glider train of artillery were supposed to be sent to capture a critical German battery, but when all of the equipment and
Failed,
most of
drowned.
the men were lost in the landing, the
Yep.
150 remaining soldiers, armed
Somehow
only
did
with
it.
rifles and Sten guns,
Yep.
took the battery nonetheless.
They somehow
It's
did it.
7:25 a.m. at Sword Beach.
Those British soldiers were
Mine-clearing
off the hook.
tanks thrash the sand. Sappers run beside them to disable mines and obstacles, frequently falling to enemy fire along the way. Then come tanks and flamethrowers throwing themselves at the German defenses on the dunes. And only then come the landing craft to release their cargoes of men. In the chaos, the schedule collapses in only half an hour. The beach has become a tangle of men, machinery, twisted wreckage, a chaos of dead, dying, and living. The air is filled with the roar of gunfire. Every moment is a drama of comedies, tragedies, and moments of heroism. But despite the cost, the landing at Sword was remarkably successful. By 9 p.m., many units were off the beaches and moving inland. At Juno, Canadian losses were heavier, but they soon broke through the coastal defenses,
Because
as
we
did the
missed
British
a
at
fucking
Gold.
target.
The landing plan had worked amazingly well considering. Almost everywhere, the German coastlines had been rolled up, and the Allies had complete control of the air. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Now was the time to strike hard and fast into the interior, to exploit the Germans' shock and seize the vital objectives, including the major town of Caen. There was a period of calm as men brewed up to recover from the initial assault,
tea
and
and
then
coffee.
they moved inland to link up with the airborne units. Unfortunately, the beachheads behind them were a massive traffic jam. The roads were chaos, and their armor
Civilians
support was
trying to
still
get out.
fighting their way through that traffic to reach them. And the Germans continued to fight hard. Key strong points resisted and slowed the British and Canadian infantry's advance.
But they
At 6
still
p.m.,
did it.
a unit of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry came under heavy fire 3 miles short of Caen and dug in for the night. With little armored support, pressing the attack and capturing
And they're
the
being
town was
kind by
not
saying
optional.
little, basically
That
no
night,
armor
men
support,
lay
by the way,
across
guys.
a 60-mile stretch with their weapons,
I think it was like only
peering
one
into
tank
a
that showed up
darkness
later
lit
that
by
night.
Flares, tracer, and shells. D-Day had been a remarkable success.
And these fools were facing
but
a
as
Panzer
elite
division.
German divisions approached, the
Yep,
fight
see.
for Normandy was about to begin, and it would be harder than any could imagine.
This is when the Nazis regrouped.
Thanks again to Wargaming for June 5th, 1944. A group of French farmers huddle around a radio tuned to the London broadcast. If they're caught, they will be thrown in prison, perhaps tortured, perhaps even executed. But they listen
Perhaps,
anyway,
it's not perhaps, bro.
and then they
For
hear
sure.
it. A single line from a French poem tossed in amongst 100
Meaning the
nonsense
invasion
phrases
starting.
disguised as personal messages. A cheer goes up, and the farmers grab their guns. That was their signal. The liberation starts tonight.
Yep. It's their job to help get bridges and key points. The
This
French
episode is
Liberation
sponsored
Squad.
by Wargaming.
Viva
New
la
players can download
Resistance.
World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. 4 years before the Normandy beach landing, the French government signed an armistice that turned all of northern France into a Nazi-occupied zone.
Because they didn't want to
insisted
get
that
bombed to
surrender
oblivion,
was
which
the
I don't
only
blame
way
them.
to save their people from being crushed by the unstoppable German war machine.
Straight up.
But from the first moment that German army boots marched down the streets of Paris, resistance groups began to spring up all over
they're
France.
badasses.
The early resistance groups were small, disorganized, and independent. They had enthusiasm, but no
Teenagers.
direction, other than a burning desire to kick the Germans out of their country. And there were not many of them. Most citizens chose to put their faith in what remained of the French government, which had fled south to the city of Vichy. They claimed to control
The Vichy
unoccupied
government.
southern France, but really they just did whatever the Germans told them to do. The early resistance lashed out by attempting to hurt or even kill German soldiers. But all they
didn't
really
work.
managed to do was provoke
Hurt themselves.
vengeance. Hitler ordered the mass execution and deportation of several thousand French Jews and
Almost done with
in
this
retaliation
blunt, and then
for
I can
strikes
start.
made by the early resistance groups. The message was clear. If you hurt our people, we will hurt yours more.
Whack.
The resistance needed to find
You
ways
get
to
out of
fight
France,
back without
asshole. You're in their
inviting
land.
retribution and making
They're not
things
walking
worse.
through
And
Deutschland or
things
whatever
had
the fuck
gotten
you call
pretty
it.
bad. By now, the German war machine, which had ground up the French
Nazis
armies in
are
less than
assholes.
6 weeks, had a desperate need for natural resources and industrial power. Two things that France had in abundance. They imposed tight rations on their French subjects and began redirecting all the wealth of France to fuel
Back
their
to
conquering
Germany,
army.
It's so whack.
That became the new resistance target. Take out the factories and the railroads so that the Germans couldn't use them anymore. As long as
You can
they
see how it
didn't
is.
harm any Germans doing it, the harshest reprisals never came. The British had that same idea.
No, you gotta kind of kill. I'm not saying kill innocent citizens. I'm saying you gotta kill Nazis, the soldiers.
Trust, and sometimes linking up with existing groups if they could find them. One of those agents would have a radio that could transmit messages back to London, requesting supply drops with weapons and explosives so that the resistance could get to work. But radios powerful enough to transmit across the channel were in pretty short supply. So they turned to Radio London, a public French-language station that had been created specifically to counter German propaganda and organize protests from safely across the English Channel. Radio London began to open and conclude every program with a nonsensical jumble of phrases that it called personal messages, which were actually coded messages for the resistance. The radio operators hiding in France would contact British headquarters with the requested supply drop and give them a random phrase like, "Pierre says hello." Then, instead of resistance members coming back to the safe house for updates every night, they could just listen at home on their radios. If Pierre said hello, they would head to their prearranged drop point. This radio system, the same one that would be used on D-Day to call the Normandy resistance cells to action, was operated by yet another group devoted to the liberation of France, the Free French. Back when the Germans had taken over northern France, a little-known general by the name of Charles de Gaulle escaped across the Channel to England. He had been appointed to government office only 12 days before, but now found himself faced with the prospect of watching his country and the government he was supposed to serve surrender to Germany.
Whack.
De Gaulle would not have it.
Hell no,
He got
'cause he's
on
a
the British
G.
radio and called for all of France to rise up and fight.
But he got
invited
kicked out
all
of the country.
soldiers who had fled from the invading Germans to join him now in London to regroup and take their country back. And he vowed to keep speaking on the radio, so that those who couldn't leave France would know that the flame of French resistance
still with them,
burned
yeah.
bright. Inspiring words, but very few people heard them. Most French people weren't exactly in the habit of listening to British radio broadcasts at this point, but those who did began to spread the word. Of 100,000 French soldiers who had escaped to Britain, 7,000 decided to stay with de Gaulle.
Scissors
It
right
was
here.
small, but it
Sorry,
was a
buddy.
start.
Go ahead and relax.
And with that start, de Gaulle vowed to take France back from the Germans and the Vichy government that had surrendered to them. He knew that a small force couldn't accomplish that task on its own. He needed to win support from Great Britain and the United States, and he needed to coordinate the scattered groups of the French resistance. Both would prove very difficult. Winston Churchill recognized de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French Resistance group, but he balked at acknowledging him to be the leader of France itself. After all, de Gaulle had never actually been elected leader of France, and now here he was trying to claim the right to lead a country that he couldn't even set foot in because its official government had sentenced him to death. To make matters worse, de Gaulle had a habit of rubbing President Roosevelt of the United States exactly the wrong way.
Yeah, he was kind of a smartass, and he beefed it with Patton.
That drove Roosevelt away also proved to be the fire that de Gaulle had promised to keep burning for France. Piece by piece, he built a government in exile, appealing to both generals and bureaucrats to abandon the Vichy government and join his cause instead.
Yes, a righteous, true government.
To push himself forward as the true leader of France, he forced the Allies to treat France as an ongoing partner in the war effort, and not as a defunct and conquered nation, like so many others under the German thumb.
Like Italy.
By 1942, 2 years
That's
before
what they're
the
really
landing
saying.
at
That's what he's
Normandy,
saying.
his
Italy
efforts
was
had
treated
begun
like
to
that.
bear fruit. He had appointed a leader to coordinate the French resistance cells on his behalf, and succeeded in forming a central committee
After
that
Italy
pledged
was
its loyalty
liberated,
to
they
him.
weren't treated
British
as an equal.
agents began to coordinate their own resistance efforts with de Gaulle's Free French, although they didn't trust him entirely. They did keep a few of their networks secret from him. Nevertheless, they worked together to create a detailed set of plans to support the upcoming Allied invasion. They would target crucial railroads, telephone systems,
They knew that this fool would accidentally sabotage it by trying to get all the fame and glory out of it. He would accidentally fucked up. That's the only reason why they kept it secret.
Enormously over the 4 years of occupation.
They're
Now,
like, the Gaulle will accidentally get us all
100,000
killed.
combatants stood ready with weapons and explosives that had been parachuted in by drops
He means
coordinated
well,
through
but he's a
radio
crazy
only.
old man.
The Allies and the Free French had pushed back on German control in the wider French Empire, winning massive victories in the French colonies of North Africa, and proving that a properly organized French army could indeed stand up to the German war machine. The Germans responded to that success by reaching for more control of France itself. They ended any pretense of the Vichy government's independence and overran the southern countryside, which only alienated more French people and bolstered recruitment for the resistance. But Germany's greatest
I think I dropped a little nugget out of it, but it's all good.
Russia and the subsequent labor draft
Still got a good amount of weed left
When
over.
the Germans broke their uneasy truce with Russia, they galvanized the many communist groups in France to take up arms against them. These brand new resistance groups never entirely accepted the leadership of the Free French or the British agents, but they were well organized in their independence and made good use of the supplies those agents gave them. Meanwhile, to compensate for the men they had sent away to fight on the Eastern Front with Russia, Germany began to draft young Frenchmen to serve as forced labor in the cogs of their machine.
Horrible.
Many fled the draft by running to the only group in France that would fight for their freedom, the resistance. So when resistance members gathered around their radios on June the 5th and finally heard the signal words that meant the liberation was on its way, they celebrated and then they got to work. In the span
Let me
of
give
a
my
single
girlfriend a
day,
tiny little
they
nug so
took
she can
down
roll herself a blunt.
577 railroads, 30 driving roads, and 32 telecommunications sites. They cut off several panzer divisions from moving north to join the German Defense Force, giving the Allies precious time to establish a beachhead before German reinforcements could arrive. And together with ordinary French citizens, many of whom now flooded to join the resistance in such numbers that the Allies didn't have enough weapons to supply them, they helped guide and support the paratroopers to strike key targets and begin dismantling German control of France. For all of the struggle, all of the setbacks, and yes, even the surrender that France faced, it was as de Gaulle predicted in that fateful
Oh, I gotta answer that when I get back.
But has the last
Those are my
word
father.
been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final?
Babe.
No.
Oh, she left already. Damn.
Thanks again to War Gaming for sponsoring this extra history episode. If you happen to be watching from Europe,
I was gonna give her that.
choice bundle in the World of Tanks Premium Shop. In the description.
Turn off this TV, girl. She don't turn anything off in here. I'll leave that in here for a little bit of weed. Got my PMs right here. I'll take those in a minute. Let's finish this roacher and let's get this game started. Got a nice fat blunt though for later. When this Laker game starts. Up on this shit. What the fuck is this shit?
June 6, 1944 is a day that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been looking forward to for a long time. His wife's birthday. With bad weather making an invasion impossible and intelligence suggesting that Eisenhower's waiting for more troops, the commander of Normandy's defenses has decided to go home and surprise his wife with a pair of Parisian shoes. In the middle of the night, his phone rings. The invasion's begun.
He's like, huh? A lot of things blessed us that day. Like I said, the paratroopers landing too far inland made it seem bigger. This fool not being there, then believing the fact that we were going to attack ports.
Neptune for free goodies. Link in the description. The Nazi leadership had begun preparing for D-Day even before the Allies held their conference
and the fact that they ran out of ammo and Hitler was asleep and didn't call up the Panzer Division to go to the beach.
Hitler had
a lot of things
realized
that day worked in our
even if an
favor.
invasion lay years off, the Allies were already capable of hitting ports in occupied France. His solution was the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal defenses that originally clustered around ports but eventually stretched from the Spanish border to Norway. Rather than building a continuous defensive barrier, German engineers drafted 1 million forced laborers from France to create a string of machine gun and artillery positions. These hard points had overlapping fields of fire, with artillery intended to fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This allowed the German army to cover a larger amount of territory with fewer men, a consideration that was crucially important by 1944. In late 1943, Hitler had appointed Rommel as overall commander of forces in northern France. It was a political as well as practical appointment, leveraging Germany's most famous general in order to reassure the troops and the public. Rommel also had a personal relationship with Hitler, which allowed him to operate semi-autonomously outside the chain of command. When Rommel arrived, he was shocked at the state of the Atlantic Wall. Command had stripped troops for the Eastern Front, and many of the men were either new recruits, conscripts from Eastern Europe, or had gone soft garrisoning the wine-soaked towns of France. Allied bombing had nullified the Luftwaffe. Rommel went to work. He sent veteran units to supplement the poorly trained divisions. He seeded the ground around the defensive emplacements with mines that jumped into the air before exploding. At low tide, he sank a forest of wooden stakes tipped with anti-tank mines that sat just below the waves. Now, any invader would have to choose between running the gauntlet at high tide or landing at low tide and crossing 300 yards of open beach. He also flooded the low country, erected poles to tear apart gliders, and stationed troops inland to slow the Allied advance in preparation for a counterattack. But planning around that counterattack was a problem. First of all, they didn't know exactly where the Allies would land. Luckily, German intelligence pulled off a coup. They successfully deployed multiple agents in England. Soon, they were receiving reports of armies marshalling to attack Pas-de-Calais, along with diversionary attacks in occupied Norway and... what was the other one? Normandy? Whatever. And aerial reconnaissance confirmed forces massing for these attacks. Of course, every single one of those German agents was actually working for the British. Good work, Garbo. Regardless of where the landings took place, Rommel believed the battle would be decided on the beaches. Should the Allies establish a beachhead, it would be over. In his plan, the divisions defending the coast would slow the enemy down in preparation for a decisive counterattack. As a result, he wanted the Panzer Reserve under his own command, close to the shore in order to sweep the Allies back into the sea. However, Hitler's leadership style started to affect strategy. From his early days in the Nazi Party, Hitler had promoted a kind of social Darwinism among his staff, giving them overlapping responsibilities and intentionally fostering feuds and competition. This meant that subordinates couldn't amass enough power to challenge him, and it elevated his position as the final arbiter of any dispute. In this case, Rommel was opposed by officers, including the elderly Eastern Front veteran von Rundstedt, who wanted the tank reserves held near Paris. This would keep them flexible in case the Allies landed somewhere unexpected, and shield them from shore bombardment. Rommel countered that the long drive toward the coast would make them vulnerable to air attacks. After fierce debate, they put it to the Führer, who, ever indecisive, created an unworkable compromise. He broke up the reserve, giving Rommel 3 panzer divisions and keeping the larger reserve around Paris as a personal unit, which couldn't be moved without his express permission. Only one of Rommel's divisions, the 21st Panzer, was sent to Normandy. So the stage is set for June 5th, and the weather could not be uglier. With conditions so poor for both sailing and flying, senior officers relax in the knowledge that the Allies will not arrive anytime soon. Many take the opportunity to rush home on leave, and that is when paratroopers start to land. At 5:30 a.m. on June 6th, German soldiers peer out of their bunkers to see shapes in the morning mist, ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Then, aircraft engines. A massive Allied bombardment rocks the ground as bombs, naval shells, and rockets pound French soil. But the bombers drop too far inland. The rockets fall short. Naval guns make little headway against the steel-reinforced bunkers. 1,745 tons of ordnance drop on Omaha Beach without killing a single German.
Yep.
But the roads inland are wrecked. Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider units land between the static units and the reserve, with resistance elements destroying crucial bridges and rail lines, meaning that reinforcements and supplies can't get through. Landing craft begin to plunge toward the shore. On Omaha Beach, the Germans see the first Allied soldiers trudging in the surf. Machine guns open fire. Far away, Allied soldiers lie face down, pinned, as the first wave of mortars and artillery shells fling bodies into the air. Months of preparation mean that German artillery crews have ranged out the beaches and know exactly where to drop their ordnance. The initial slaughter is monumentally one-sided. One American company at Omaha takes 92% casualties. By 1:30 that afternoon, German observers at Omaha report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing the Allies back into the sea. But Omaha is the exception. Despite fierce resistance, the British have broken through at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians at Juneau. The botched American landing at Utah has reorganized into a chaotic opportunity. Here, the bombardments have had more effect, and the terrain isn't as challenging, but men still die in droves. The chaos on the beach is mirrored at every German headquarters between Normandy and Hitler's vacation home at Berchtesgaden. Generals argue over whether to commit reserves and where. Rommel is rushing toward the battle in a staff car, unable to issue orders. His rival, von Rundstedt, quickly orders the 21st Panzer to meet the British advancing on Caen, and issues orders for the reserve units near Paris to move out. But his orders are countermanded. That unit can only be moved by the Führer's personal order, and Hitler is asleep. Ever since his days as a Bohemian in Vienna, Hitler has always been a late riser. Rigid procedure dictates that the Führer should not be woken unnecessarily, and even in the face of invasion, no one wants to break this protocol. After all, what if it's only a diversion? When Hitler eventually wakes at noon, he is thrilled the invasion has arrived. This, he says, is his chance to decisively crush the Allies. And yet, he delays. It's 4 p.m. before he orders the Panzer Reserve to move out. By that time, the clouds have cleared, exposing the column to Allied air power. So, instead of advancing, the unit ends up hiding in the woods until dusk. It will take them 2 days and a night to join the battle. As the Allies overwhelm German defenses and march inland, Hitler spends his day ordering V-1 revenge strikes not on Normandy, but on London, then holds a conference with minor functionaries. When Goebbels shows him the Normandy landings on a map, Hitler exclaims with delight, "Just where we expected them." Goebbels, who has heard Hitler rant for months about how the Allied target would be Calais, simply nods at the Führer's historical revisionism.
No, it's like Trump.
Hitler is somewhat right, in a way. They all knew that a diversionary landing would happen at Normandy. Probably best to keep the strong units in Calais. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Wall is crumbling. Even at Omaha, the defense has degraded. Ammunition is running out. Artillery emplacements fall silent. Americans begin breaking through and enveloping the casements. At Caen, the Germans see one last opportunity, a gap between the Canadian and British lines. A grenadier regiment rushes to exploit it, and by 8 p.m. radios that they're on the beach. With armored support, they can hold. But the Allies have gotten wise. When the 21st Panzer tries to follow, they find themselves running a gauntlet. Fire pours in from both sides. Every minute, another tank explodes. Seeing that the window of opportunity has closed, their commander orders them to halt and dig in around Caen. But the defense is stiffening. All along the battlefront, Allied units begin failing their first-day objectives of advancing and linking up inland. By dusk, the Allies have scattered beachheads, but not much more. Within days, German reinforcements will arrive, and the hedgerows of Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings. D-Day is over, but Operation Overlord could still fail. To win, the Allies are going to have to push just as hard on D-Day +1, and D-Day +2, and every day after that. For all of these forces, American, British Commonwealth, French, German, and Soviet, the fight would continue for 11 murderous months. But the Allies now had a beachhead, and in trying to throw them back, Germany would spend more men, fuel, and equipment that they could ill afford. Allied victory is a long way off, but for the first time, it's in sight.
This boy just needs to put them all on one big playlist.
What can you do in 30 days? At National University, we think a lot. That's why we offer 4-week classes across over 100 online and on-campus degree programs. So you can start sooner, finish faster, and focus on what matters most. National University, veteran-founded, nonprofit. Find your program today at nu.edu.
Hey everybody, welcome to a very strange episode of Lies. I am here today hanging out with Richard Cutler. Richard, do you want to talk about yourself and why we're doing this thing?
Do I want to talk about myself, James? Not really. Yeah, well, thank you for inviting us to your marvellous show. I am Richard Cutler, Head of Military Relations for Europe. I won't bore you with all the detail. Obviously, wargaming.net, hopefully the viewers are quite aware who we are by now. Me personally, I'm an ex-British Army tanker, so 30 years in the British Army, and I've been with wargaming about 5 years now, so that's me.
And we just thought it was rad that we had an actual expert to talk to, and one who encouraged more game companies to hire more people of that ilk. So we figured today we'd do sort of a pseudo-Lies episode for the D-Day series as Normandy, which it's not. But you know,
otherwise, these things happen. These things happen.
So. Yeah, because we have you on, I would love to dive in and talk about all the cool toys and equipment.
1697. Sweden is one of the truly great powers of Europe, with an unstoppable army and an empire that nearly encircles the Baltic. But as the church bells toll, the world knows the king is dead and his 14-year-old son is inheritor to the crown. The vultures begin to circle. The danger of empire is that the more you have that other people want, and the Swedish Empire was no exception. In this case, the lands of the Swedish Empire had drawn the attention of someone brilliant, dynamic, ruthless, and ambitious. The 25-year-old Peter the Great. Peter had a love of the West. He was drawn to all things European. He saw the future of Russia not to the south or the east, but chasing the setting sun. He saw that future in becoming part of the great European economic system. But there was one obstacle to this grand design. He needed a port in the Baltic. He needed a way his ships could sail west bearing Russian goods or projecting the might of Russian arms. But the Baltic ports that Russia had once held had all been gobbled up by the Swedish Empire.
I don't know why my voice is going
out. Now it was time to take them back. But Peter wasn't alone. The king of the Danes had long chafed under the idea that traditionally Danish land in southern Sweden had been taken from them by the Swedish Empire, and he longed to get it back. And Augustus, the king of Poland-Lithuania, found an intriguing prospect within the Swedish borders as well. You see, the Polish-Lithuanian king was an elected title without much power, but he wanted to become a hereditary monarch, ruling over Poland-Lithuania as many of the other monarchs of Europe ruled over their domain. Right on his border, just inside the Swedish territory, was the small province of Livonia. The nobles there offered to declare him their hereditary king if he would liberate them from the Swedish. This intrigued him. If he could get them to declare him king and then integrate them with Poland-Lithuania, it would go a long way toward achieving his larger goal of making a real kingship out of the Polish-Lithuanian crown. Soon, these three forces became secret allies against the Swedish. Things dragged on for a while as Peter continued to pretend to be a friend of Sweden, hoping to avoid a war with them until his current war with the Ottomans could be wrapped up. But at last, in 1700, his allies moved ahead, striking at the Swedes without warning, though in a piecemeal and ill-coordinated fashion. 14,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops marched across the border of Livonia first and laid siege to the capital. But the Swedes counterattacked. The Polish-Lithuanian troops were shattered. Their general lay dead. Soon, they were in full retreat back to the border. Then the Danes made their move, a move to which Charles XII, the boy king of Sweden, responded with unexpected vigor. With the energy of youth, Charles raised money from every quarter, bolstering the finances of the overextended Swedish Empire and launching a force that he himself would lead. After daring naval maneuvers and a surprise landing, the stunned Danish forces capitulated and left the alliance against the Swedes entirely. Meanwhile, Peter still stood by. It was the perfect time to press the Swedes, and he knew it, but still no word of peace had come from the Ottomans. At last, when the peace was signed with the Ottomans in the hottest days of summer, it was finally Peter's turn to act. And act he did. To support the now reeling Polish-Lithuanian forces, he raised a massive army and marched toward Livonia. His objective was Narva, a major town right on the Russian border. But in this age, with the mud and roads of Russia, an army of that size moved pretty slowly. It was November before they reached Narva. In the biting cold, they dug trenches into the frozen ground and prepared for a siege. But their guns did little, and their assaults were swept aside. So a real siege it became, to starve the town out. But once Charles XII had thrashed the Danes, he had wasted no time packing up his little army and moving it east to deal with the invasion of Livonia. Braving autumn storms on the Baltic, he personally led his forces toward the true test of their strength. Many of his counselors argued against this endeavor. After all, even if he got to Livonia, he'd have to march his troops 150 miles across wasted ground in the middle of winter. And if he actually reached Narva, he would be outnumbered at least...
Hi everyone. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be doing some sponsored series on World War II. And or to show to
Cicero once said that the sinews of war were infinite money. Never has that been more true than in the Second World War. This little bonus extra history series is going to be all about the complex economic struggle that underpinned the most colossal conflict in human history. These episodes are happening courtesy of the good folks at Paradox, who, after seeing those old Punic Wars episodes, human history is equal parts heroism, tragedy, and misunderstanding. Very rarely have we displayed all three to such a degree as in the First World War. This war is called the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, because without it there is no Stalin and no Hitler, no fascism or World War II. Without it, we don't have a Cold War that leads us to the very brink of annihilation, nor do we see the Middle East carved up by old men, still bitter from 4 years of meaningless, self-inflicted catastrophe. Without this war, we probably don't have 9/11 or the turmoil in the Middle East today. This war ushered in the modern age, born in a crucible of gunpowder and toxic smoke and the blood of 10 million men. Blood spilt in war from the fields of France to the waters off America, from the Russian frontier to the sands of the Middle East, from the Chinese mainland to the deepest parts of the sea. This war broke empires. It shattered the past and forced us to give up our last ties to our medieval understanding. When the smoke cleared and a stunned world climbed out of its trenches, we lived in a new age, with new powers, new ideas, and new terrors. It is the defining event of the 20th century. It is the Great War. But it's not the war itself that we're here to talk about today. Hopefully, over the course of this show, a bit at a time, we'll slowly, story by story, cover the sprawling events of this turning point in history. But today we are focused on the events that led to this war. For if the war itself is the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, then the weeks before the war are its seminal tragedy. In these next few episodes, we'll focus on the very human, very personal stories that led Europe to consume itself, to ignite itself in one suicidal blaze from which it still hasn't recovered, because it is a tragedy of the highest order. It's like a play, a Greek epic, a story so grand we would think it must be fiction if the scars of the war couldn't still be seen on the fields of France. It's Shakespeare living out before us. It begins with the death of a prince and his lady, and ends in mass slaughter the likes of which the world has never seen. So let's set the stage. For 100 years, Europe has been at peace. There have been wars, sure, but they were minor wars. Wars on the periphery. Wars without many of the great powers involved. Not since Napoleon did the great states of Europe vie in bloody battle. For after the ravages of the Napoleonic Wars, the statesmen of Europe had come together to try to stop such a catastrophe from ever happening again. They created a system called the Concert of Europe, so that whenever